Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Institute on Religion and Democracy. My name is Max Proant. I'm a research fellow with IRD, and it is my distinct pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker, Mustafa Akyol. This past year, I've hosted a lecture series on the persistent threat of jihadism and both its Sunni and Shia manifestations. Talk of jihad, however, can be somewhat of a weary subject, and as I begin to wrap up this lecture series, I wanted to end on a more hopeful note. That is, I did not want to leave the impression that Islam is, or ever has been, about primarily jihad. Accordingly, I wanted to begin to close this series on a note that stresses the potential avenues of Islam, or for Islam, to have a more liberal future. As a Muslim and an accomplished scholar, Mustafa Akyol is particularly qualified to speak on this subject. While he needs no introduction, allow me to highlight a few of his accomplishments. Mr. Akyol is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity. He has published with the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and he has also authored a number of books, including Reopening Muslim Minds, A Return to Reason, Freedom, and Tolerance. Most recently, The Islamic Moses, How the Prophet Inspired Jews and Muslims to Flourish Together and Change the World. And Why, as a Muslim, I Defend Liberty. In fact, we're actually selling copies of that last book for $10. If you're interested, we have them over there. Just come see me after the event. So, if you haven't already, please help yourself to some food and beverages. Mr. Akyol will speak for about 45 minutes or so, with a brief question period at the end. Without further ado, please welcome Mustafa Akyol.
Thank you very much, Max, for this kind introduction. Thank you, my good friend Mark Tooley, for also hosting me here at the Institute for Religion and Democracy. Just one thing, Max, the book Islamic Moses has not come out yet, but in September, inshallah, as we say. So it will be a book that discusses what I call the Judeo-Islamic tradition. People have Judeo-Christian tradition in mind, which is there, important. But I argue that there's a Judeo-Islamic tradition, which has been eclipsed so much by the contemporary political conflict in the Middle East. But I think the two religions are very connected, and actually they had a better history until the 20th century. But today I'll speak about what I call Islamic liberalism. The title is Islam's Uncertain Path to Liberalism. It's Max's title. It's good. It's provocative. I liked it. I said, okay, let's go with it. And I could speak about this like 5 days or even weeks if you wanted. So it's a huge topic, as you can imagine. But tonight I'll just try to put a few things in a nutshell briefly. And I want to begin with a personal story, which sometimes helps me elucidate things. That story is from 2017. I was a newcomer to the US from Turkey, my home country, whose politics is a mess, by the way. We can talk about it if you want, but again, that's not our topic tonight. I got an invitation to go to Kuala Lumpur, the capital of Malaysia, to give a series of public talks. I was invited by the Islamic Renaissance Front. It's a human rights NGO inspired by Islamic values. And they're my friends in Malaysia. They had me over to Malaysia 5 times in 10 years. And they said, Mustafa, come back again, because they just had printed the Malay edition of my book, Islam Without Extremes, A Muslim Case for Liberty. So they were going to do book launch events. And I looked to Kuala Lumpur from the East Coast here, and I just realized it's exactly the other end of the globe. And I said, will I do this? Okay, I will. And I did. So it was a very long journey to KL. And I went there, and there were 4 events lined one after another. And one of them was on a sensitive topic, the topic of apostasy, which is publicly giving up one's religion, right? So if you're a Muslim and you lost faith and you become a Christian or an atheist, you become an apostate from Islam. Same thing for Christianity. And I think probably most of us here tonight agree that if people become apostates, if they lose the faith, I mean, as fellow believers, we can be sad about that, and we can maybe try to reach out them again to convince them, maybe. But it's their choice. We wouldn't consider it as a crime. However, it is considered as a crime in about a dozen countries in the world today. These are all Islamic, quote-unquote, countries, states, and they include Saudi Arabia, Iran, Yemen, Mauritania, Afghanistan for sure, especially now under the Taliban, and a few others, because they think that apostasy from Islam, as defined by Islamic law, as they interpret it and believe in it, is a crime, and the punishment in their laws is the death penalty. Rarely implemented. When it happens, it becomes news most of the time, but it's there. Now, Malaysia is a moderate country. They emphasize that a lot. So they don't have the death penalty for apostates, but they send apostates to rehabilitation centers. So I talked to a Malay audience for 30 minutes, and then there were other people who commented on it. And I said, look, I'm not an imam, I'm not a sheikh, I'm not claiming any religious authority. I'm just a Muslim researcher, scholar, journalist, whatever you call it, working on these issues for a long time, researching these issues. And I'll tell you that we can revisit this law for a few reasons. First of all, there is no basis for this apostasy ban in the whole Quran. It doesn't come from the Quran. It's a very well-known fact. In the Quran, there are actually quite contrary verses that seem to vindicate religious freedom. Like, there is no compulsion in religion. That's a oft-quoted Quranic verse, which we'll come to in a second. Then I said, this ban on apostasy comes from medieval Islamic law, but at the time, do not forget that apostasy had a whole different meaning. It also meant rebellion against the state. That's why actually all empires had similar laws. Byzantine empires or Sassanid empires also laws that punished apostasy because they thought if you leave the religion, you join the enemy, because your connection with the state was also defined by your religion, which is not the same thing today. We live in a different world, so we can't let that go. And third, I said, it doesn't also make sense if people don't believe in a religion. You cannot make them believe back by any force, by any threat. You cannot make them real believers. You can make them hypocrites. And that's not something we want to see. Because I said, religion is a sincere conviction that cannot be compelled from the outside. A typical John Lockean argument, I should say. Religion, I said, therefore, is not something that you can police. Now, the audience loved the talk. There were applause, and people talked to me after the event, and I was just getting ready to leave. And then 5 serious men walked into the room, and they came towards me, and they said, "Are you Mustafa Akyol?" I said, "Yes." They said, "Did you say religion cannot be policed?" I said, "Yes." They said, "Good, we are the religion police." And the man showed me his card, and it writes Religion Enforcement Officer. He's right. That's his job. So in Malaysia, they do have an institution called the Religion Police. Much milder than what you have under the Taliban, but they have it. And they said, they heard complaints about my talk, and they asked me a few questions, and they took a photo of me, and I said, "What's going on?" But they said, "We will look into your talk, and then we'll let you about the next steps, if there are next steps." I said, "Okay." I didn't think it was a big deal. So I went to, I had good Indonesian food. Then I went to a hotel, and I woke up the next day, and I learned that they issued an arrest order they summoned me to the religious police headquarters to ask me about, further question me. Then my host said, just take your flight tonight and leave the country. You don't need to deal with this. We will deal with lawyers. And I went to the airport at 6 p.m., but I realized when I gave my passport to the passport check, they had issued an arrest order. So I was detained at the airport. And a few hours later, the religion police came. And they said, you violated a law which bans teaching religion without permission from authorities. And the punishment for that is 2 years in jail. So I was taken by them to the religious police headquarters back. I was locked in that night. Next day, I was taken to a court. I was questioned for 2 hours. And they asked me like, who abetted you? What's your purpose? And, a lot of suspicious questions. But also they said, did you quote the Quran, no compulsion in religion verse? I said, yeah, I quoted. I mean, what could be the problem with that? They wrote it down that, he quoted that. And then they said, we'll let you go. I said, thank you. I mean, that's the best thing I heard since last night. But they said, don't come back to Malaysia and teach religion again. I said, you can be sure about that. Like, no way. So they let me go. And yes, I took the flight again next time. So I was lucky. I was lucky thanks to some diplomacy as well. But when I was boarding on the plane again, some 24 hours later, after the initial plan, I was thinking, like, why are they obsessed with me for quoting the Quran? There is no compulsion in religion. Because it's actually a very controversial verse in the sense that the liberal-minded Muslims, I would put myself in that category, think that here's a Quranic confirmation of full religious freedom. There is no compulsion in religion. So religion is based on the individual conscience and people can practice it as they believe. If they don't believe, it's still their choice. And while they're in it, it's still their choice. So they should not be compelled from the outside. That's what many Muslims today intuitively understand from the verse. However, the Malaysian religion police, as well as the Taliban, as well as the Saudi establishment, as well as the Iranian religion police and the whole Islamic Republic, they want to make sure that the verse doesn't exactly mean that. So I checked. So before getting on the plane, I said, okay, let me see how they translate it. Obviously, it's an Arabic term, la ikrah fi din, but how do you translate it in English? So I went there and I checked the JAKIM website. That's the official religious ministry. And I saw what I suspected. While they're translating into English, they put a few words in parentheses. So the word starts to mean something much narrower. So this is how it looks. So this is actually a long verse. There is no compulsion in religion. The truth has become manifest from error. It goes on like that. But that's the beginning. There shall be no compulsion in religion. So this is the Malaysian JAKIM website. That's the official religious ministry. It writes, there shall be no compulsion in religion in becoming a Muslim. Now, that is not in the verse. They're just adding that in parentheses to make sure that, they explain it better. Some Saudi translations do a similar editing. And this is Sahih International, published in Saudi Arabia, distributed around the world. It says, there shall be no compulsion in religion in acceptance of the religion. Again, the word acceptance of is not in the original verse, but they are adding that as an explanation. Now, the question is, what is the difference that this little insertion make? Well, the difference is, if you say there's no compulsion in religion, as I said, you can enter religion, you can exit, no compulsion. But if there's no compulsion only in entering the religion, it means that you can enter, you can accept it, but then you cannot exit. Right? So because they believe in apostasy laws, which are not in the Quran, but the verse seems to kind of go against that, they want to make sure that it's interpreted that way. Now, this is one of the hundreds and bones of contention about religious texts that you can come across in the Muslim world these days. These days being actually for decades. Do we need really apostasy laws? Does the Quran really say that? Did the Prophet Muhammad really have a saying which really said apostates should be executed? Is that saying really authentic? It comes from just one source. Can a saying that comes from one source be more powerful than the Quran? Can it override the Quran? No, yes, there are endless discussions about these issues. What about blasphemy laws? Again, there's nothing in the Quran about that, but there are medieval texts which says blasphemers against Prophet Muhammad should be punished by death. And there are people who take this seriously, especially in Pakistan, even sometimes on the very extreme and suburbs of some European communities. That's why you've seen attacks on Charlie Hebdo cartoons and things like that. Those groups, I should say, the people who go out, even in Europe, attack blasphemers. They are a very small group of extremists, but they are relying on a larger tradition of thinking that blasphemers should be punished. The conservatives would tell you that, yeah, they should be punished in a court of law in a Muslim majority country, so it would be milder than their interpretation, but still it would not be a liberal interpretation. And the liberal Muslims would saying, well, no, we don't need these kind of things. We let people just practice their religion in they want. So there are these kind of issues of blasphemy, apostasy, legal equality, women's rights. And I should tell them the groups that make the news about these issues are generally the most disturbing ones. They're not the only ones out there. I should guarantee that. They're mostly most extremist ones, but there's a whole range of opinions, and it's a lot of textual interpretation of what these texts really mean. And as this experience shows, there is a liberal interpretation of these texts, and some people don't like it, and that's why they want to ban that. Now, this is just a little scene from Islamic thought and its connection to freedom. Now, but how did it all begin? Should say a few things about Islam, I think, as a civilization, as a religion, to give you a broader sense of the picture. As you all know, Islam began in early 7th century in Arabia. This is where everything begins. In the beginning, there was Prophet Muhammad. At the time, Arabia was a place like this. It was a small, it was not like an unimportant place compared to the big empires of the world. There were two big empires, the Byzantine and Sassanid empires. Arabia was a backwater. The two cities there, Medina and Mecca, were important cities. Mecca was a city of trade. It was a city of merchants. And in the year 610, as we Muslims believe, one of the merchants in town, whose name is Muhammad, peace be upon him, as we Muslims say, one night at a cave heard a divine voice. Angel Gabriel talked to him and said, Ikra, which means recite in the name of God who created men. This was the first words of the Quran. That's why Quran is called recitation. And Prophet Muhammad didn't know what this was, and he was scared. But this was what we take as the first revelation. Here's a picture of that made by a medieval Muslim polymath, Rashid al-Din, in the early 14th century. Prophet Muhammad receiving the angelic revelation. As you can see, his face is depicted, which is rare, but it happens in classical Islam. There are a few depictions of Prophet Muhammad like this. So I'm showing this in part because there was a controversy in Hemline University about a year ago. A professor showed this in school, and one of his students said, oh my God, this is an Islamophobic attack on students. Well, it's not Islamophobic, it's Islamic. It's from an Islamic book that came out of an Islamic scholar, Rashid al-Din, who was praising Prophet Muhammad for sure. And some people in the Persian tradition especially didn't see a problem in depicting his face. So, of course, making a mockery of him would be a different thing. A cartoon would be not considered welcome by Muslims, but just mere depiction is not a problem. But anyway, Prophet Muhammad heard the voice, and then he was scared, and he didn't know what this was, but ultimately he was comforted by his wife, who went to a Christian in the city whose name was Waraka. And Muhammad said, this is what I heard from this strange voice. And he said, and the Christian priest, Waraka, listened to Muhammad and says, this is not a demon. You must be a prophet like Moses to your people, right? So that's how Prophet Muhammad got convinced that he's a real prophet. And then he started to preach, first silently and then publicly in the next 13 years, this new message that we today call Islam. Now, what is the main message of Islam? What's the main content of it? The key issue, the key mission in history? It was a call for monotheism to a polytheistic society. Before Islam, Arabs were worshiping hundreds of gods, idols. The Kaaba, the cube-shaped building in the middle of Mecca, was a pagan pantheon filled with these idols. And Muhammad came and told them still the basic motto of Islam, which is no God but the God. La ilaha illallah, which means no God but the God. the God. Who is this God? First of all, I should say that the God in Arabic, when you combine these words, the and God, which is al and ilah, they become Allah. So in Arabic, we say la ilaha illallah. So Allah is just simply meaning the God. It's not a specific name for a deity. It's it's not something like Odin or it's just in the Arabic language, like you have Dieu or, and different names for God in different languages, different terms for the word God. So it means God. And the Quran repeatedly also made it clear that this is the God of Abraham. If you have any doubt, this is the very God who spoke to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses and Jesus Christ and Mary. All are mentioned and honored and praised in the Quran. And then finally, the same God speaks to Muhammad because he has to bring his people from idolatry to monotheism. This is the basic story. That's why one of the scholars who wrote about the moral message of Islam said Islam is basically an anti-idolatrous campaign. Now, I think some people have taken this whole idea of anti-idolatry to extreme. That's why they break statues in Bamiyan. And, I think that's just too much extreme understanding of that. But the original idea was monotheism to a polytheistic society. Now, if you preach monotheism to a polytheistic society, what happens to you? Well, if the polytheistic society is a very liberal one, they would say, we have freedom of speech, say whatever you want. That's your opinion. We don't agree with you. But that's not how Mecca looked like. Meccan polytheists, these were mostly merchants, didn't like this new religion. They were fine if Muslims just worship one God among many, but Muslims were saying others are false gods. That was an offense. So they took offense from this new preaching. And we know this from what their message to Prophet's uncle, Muhammad's uncle was a prominent figure in Mecca, who protected his nephew. And they came to him and they said, your nephew has cursed our gods, insulted our religion, mocked our way of life, and accuse our forefathers of error. Either you must stop him or you must let us get at him. Now, I use this quote and I sometimes remind fellow Muslims that, so Islam was guilty of blasphemy. We were blaspheming the pagan gods. So maybe we shouldn't have blasphemy laws. It was the first thing that used against us in the first place. Of course, not everybody agrees with that. They think that blasphemy against the wrong religion is good, but blasphemy against the right religion is necessary. But that's another point. So they said this, and of course, this was the beginning of a long campaign to persecute the first Muslims in Mecca. What happened was in about 10 years, there's a 13-year period in Mecca, but the first 3 years were mostly discreet. Pagans persecuted Muslims. How? By torture. I mean, especially some slaves who had become Muslims were tortured. 2 of them were killed by their slave owners. Others were abused in different ways. And actually, that's why Prophet Muhammad told some of them, the weakest ones in the early years of the Mecca period, to escape from Mecca and go to a kingdom who would protect them. And this kingdom was the kingdom of Abyssinia. This was a Christian kingdom on the other side of the Red Sea. And Muslims went there, and the king actually listened to them. The king said, what does your religion teach about Jesus? They said, we believe that he was born of Virgin Mary by miracle of God, and he's Messiah, and he's the word of God. And the king said, you're good. He said it more eloquently, but he said, come to my kingdom, I'll protect you. And he did. And he said, there's little difference between you and us, basically. So Muslims actually remember that savior Christian king from Ethiopia. But the persecution didn't end. And then ultimately Prophet Muhammad himself was under threat. And he and Muslims finally, most of them left Mecca and migrated to another city called Medina. So, and when they went to Medina in this new city, they found that they're freer now. but there were a lot of still persecuted people in Mecca. Their properties were plundered. So they said, this is the time now we take up arms and defend ourselves and get our homeland back. So with hijra, as we call it, and migration, there began a new phase. I'll just go quickly here. These are what we call, jihad. Now, I'll ask you a question. Does this story sound similar to another scriptural story that you may know? Like a group of believers being persecuted in one land, then migrating, or like having an exodus to another land, and they're taking up arms to protect themselves. Now we are freer and, Yes, it is a little bit of an Old Testament story. And I think it's not an accident that the most dominant figure in the whole Quran is Moses. He's the paradigmatic prophet for Prophet Muhammad, and his story of fighting with the Pharaoh and escaping, and the Red Sea, the Pharaoh being drawn. It's told over repeatedly in the Quran. The Muslims identify themselves with the Israelites throughout the Quranic chapters, and you can clearly see that. So what happens after this Hijrah period? Muslims, when they went to Medina, soon a commandment comes. This is the first verse in the Quran, which allows jihad. The Quran actually doesn't necessarily call jihad, qital, that's war. That's a more used term. But this is the first first revelation that allows what we today call as jihad, like armed struggle in the name of Islam. And it says, those who have been attacked are permitted to take up arms because they have been wronged. They are those who have been driven unjustly from their homes only for saying, our Lord is God. Now, so why are they allowed to fight? Because they have been wronged. Not just those guys are just polytheists. If they didn't persecute the Muslims, maybe there would not be no need for this. But no, they have been persecuted. They've been driven out of their homes, and they've been just for saying our Lord is God. Muslims didn't attack them. They attacked them first. So I think that's a key point that today used by Muslims who emphasize that the whole idea of jihad began because they persecuted us. It wasn't that Muslims went out there to fight the pagans and their allies. Of course, later in Islamic history, growingly, there would be other verses, and medieval Islamic jurisprudence would think, yeah, there is defensive jihad, but you can go offensive too. So offensive jihad was later justified too. But this is not the first verse in the Quran, nor the Quranic spirit, actually, according to at least many interpretations. But what happened is after this, there has been many battles. If you read, it's like the Old Testament, right? I mean, there are battles, and actually milder in many ways, as some scholars said. But there are battles with the polytheists, several. Battle of Badr, Battle of Uhud, and goes on and goes on. And ultimately, when Prophet Muhammad passes away, here's a picture showing the battles of Prophet Muhammad. Is a painting, a miniature from the Ottoman tradition. His face is covered this time, so that's a more common time in the green thing. And therefore, I should say, today, many Muslims on the issue of jihad, they say, well, jihad means if your country is attacked, if your family is attacked, if your religion is attacked, you can defend yourself. That is legitimate jihad. It doesn't mean going out there killing people. It doesn't mean terrorism. It doesn't mean even offensive war. That's the more moderate interpretation. And I think most conservatives would agree that you cannot attack civilians in any jihad. Anyway, Prophet Muhammad passed away in the year 632. And what happens is Muslims established an empire growingly. So Muslims this was an age of empires. There were the Byzantine and Sassanid empires kept on. So this is how in about 130 years after the Prophet, that's like 150 years about the Prophet, Muslims created an empire stretching from Spain to India. So here, religion and certainly military and political force combined in many ways. And that's not, as we understand today, as liberalism, right? However, there are two things to say about this early Islamic empire. Muslims conquered places, but they did not force people to convert to Islam. The only people that were forced to convert to Islam were the early Arab pagans, because idolatry could not be tolerated. But after that, Muslims had the idea that Jews, Christians, they are the people of the book. They are people, they're monotheists. They have some problems, Quran criticizes them, but still the Quran doesn't delegitimize them. So their religion was recognized as legit. And then Zoroastrians were added to that. And when Muslims came to India, actually, they thought, what do we do with the Indians? I mean, the Hindus. They extended the category to Indians as well. So Muslims conquered places, but they did not force them to convert to Islam. They just brought a status called the Dhimmi status, which is today criticized as discriminatory and hegemonic. True, from a liberal point of view, it doesn't look very good. But at that time, there was no equal citizenship anywhere in the world. And actually, for many communities, you just pay an extra tax and accept Muslim political sovereignty and live under that. That was not a bad deal for many communities. And that's why we know many Jews preferred, from the first century to the Ottoman times, Islamic rule to other rules around, especially Christian rule, because Christianity was not in its liberal phase. There was a lot of forced conversion and persecution of Jews this time in Visigothic Spain, in the Syria-Palestine area, which was Byzantine Empire. And later, when Jews were persecuted in Spain, they would come to the Ottoman Empire, where they would find safety. Now, therefore, one aspect of early Islamic empire was religious pluralism, as Christians, Jews, and most others were tolerated. One of the scholars who observed this was Bernard Lewis, who said, the medieval Islamic world offered vastly more freedom than any of its predecessors, its contemporaries, and most of its successors. And Lewis was not shy of criticizing Islam when he thought there's something to criticize, but also I think he was fair to acknowledge some of the virtues of the Islamic civilization, and this is one of those moments. Now, another pillar of the early Islamic empire was on the economic field. Now, Prophet Muhammad had a job before being a prophet, right? And I mentioned that, I guess. He was a merchant. Among the founders of all world religions, he's the only one who was engaged in business before starting a religious mission. And his companions, many of them were merchants. Mecca was a city of merchants. And that tradition lived on. When Islam became a religion, this market-friendly teachings started to continue in Islam. You can see that in the Quran. You see that in Prophet's sayings. You see that in the fact that when came to Medina, he founded an army, but he found a mosque, but he did something else. He founded a marketplace. And he famously said, this is your market, let no tax be taken on it. And that became a fashionable market because of tax-free market. And then Muslims actually started to build a religious law which enforced contracts, had trade in mind, and protected traders. It was a very business-focused religious law. And Muslims created what people call merchant capitalism throughout the early centuries of Islam. And this also created cosmopolitanism because you had cities of like Kufa, Baghdad, Basra, earlier than Damascus, where Islamic scholars engaged in trade, people went and go. These became cosmopolitan cities. They then started to learn existing traditions like Greek philosophy. They started to grapple with Christian theology, Indian traditions. In just a few centuries, the cities of Islam, especially in Iraq, became the most cosmopolitan cities in the world. And that's why they started to invent new things. They rented something called, or let's say advanced, something they called al-Jabir, which became algebra in English. Or Islamic scholar al-Khwarizmi developed some mathematical equations, became algorithm in English language. While Muslims were carrying, Muslim merchants, instead of carrying a lot of cash, they carried a document showing that they have money somewhere. They called it sak, which means written document, which became check in English. And of course, they use numbers that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, which became Arabic numerals. I mean, they're called Arabic numerals for a reason because they came from the Arabic world. Before that, the West had Roman numerals, and they look great in chapter numbers, but try calculating with them. They're not very efficient in that sense. So there's this brilliant time. So Fernand Braudel, the great French historian, said 4 or 5 centuries, Islam was the most brilliant civilization. Now, one of the brilliant aspects of the civilization were the age of great thinkers. Muslims had people like Avicenna, Al-Farabi, Ibn Rushd, Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, and Ibn Rushd, which all have Latinized names, Al-Faribus, Avicenna, because, they influenced Latin Europe a lot. I mean, they studied Greek philosophy and passed it on to Europe through Spain. But I'm interested in a particular Islamic thinker who was really great and who had an interesting and little-known impact even in Western thought. And that was Ibn Khaldun. I don't know if you're familiar with Ibn Khaldun. He was the last of the, I think, greatest medieval Islamic thinkers. He lived in the 15th century in North Africa. He was what we would call today a social scientist. He examined the kingdoms of his time. He tried to understand the dynamics which makes some kingdoms greater than others, which he wrote in his book Muqaddimah, which means introduction to his history, because he has a whole book called Book of History. There, he made observations like high taxation suffocates an economy. He predicted that the decline of kingdoms where the state, instead of private businesses, dominates trade and production. He emphasized the crucial need for property rights for creating prosperity. Now, Ibn Khaldun's ideas later influenced some Western thinkers, Western social scientists, economists, especially his observation that the higher a tax rate becomes, the poorer that country becomes. That influenced a economist called Arthur Laffer, that you may have heard of, who developed the Arthur Laffer curve about optimal tax rates. But even more than that, Ibn Khaldun had a very famous student, which you may know. I'm sure you all know. He was a U.S. President, Ronald Reagan. Oh my God, what is that? Sorry, there's some. I had to stop this. Got it. So Reagan, in a press conference in 1981, talked about him. Let's see what he says.
College.
Let me just. Sorry.
I studied economics in college when I was young, and I learned there about a man named Ibn Khaldun, who lived 1,200 years ago in Egypt. And 1,200 years ago, he said, in the beginning of the empire, the rates were low, the tax rates were low, but the revenue was great. He said in the end of the empire, when the empire was collapsing, the rates were great and the revenue was low.
So President Reagan was wrong about the century. It was not 1,200 years ago. It was, let's say, less than that. But he was right about Ibn Khaldun's observation. And at the time, Americans like, who's this Ibn Khaldun? And New York Times historian, and they asked Franz Rosenthal, who was a great scholar who translated the Muqaddimah into English. He says, Rosenthal said, he's right. Yeah, I mean, that's what Ibn Khaldun said. And now I'm showing these things to say that the idea of freedom, religious freedom or economic freedom, or freedom of the individual and markets and ideas, these are not alien to Islam. It's just there, but then there are problematic apostasy laws and blasphemy laws and legal supremacy and medieval jurisprudence around that too. And I think Muslims will have a road towards liberalism when not they only hear it from Western scholars and thinkers, which is important. I mean, when I read John Locke, I said, oh my God, he's speaking about our issues today. I mean, when I read, but when they also read Ibn Khaldun a bit more carefully, when they go back and look at some of the medieval discussions about religious freedom. And so they have to build from their own roots, a sense of liberalism. Liberalism, I mean in the classical sense of limited government, individual rights, religious freedom, freedom of expression, and so on and so forth. And some people think that, oh, this is impossible. Islam has always been an oppressive religion and so on. So it's like, what are you talking about? I mean, for centuries, Islam was the more open, civilization, the more tolerant civilization. That's why minorities escaped from Europe to the lands of Islam for centuries. Now it's the other way around, and that's a bitter fact that we Muslims have to see. So I think, my work is about finding the roots, authentic roots of toleration, freedom, rule of law in the Islamic civilization, and they are actually abundant if you look for it, as well as there are challenges. Now, but I mean, you can make ideas, but what about these ideas? These ideas have a history. First of all, I should say that after this more brilliant age in Islam, there has been a more stagnant era. So Bernard Lewis discusses this in his famous book, What Went Wrong? And I think people have different ideas about this, like why the Islamic civilization was so brilliant, but then it didn't continue in that way. Two answers is that, first of all, actually, what changes the West rather than Islam itself, first of all? A whole new thing began in the West with with scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, liberalism, human rights. I mean, the West was actually in such a dire strait, during the Protestant Catholic wars, religious wars, that they had to find a way out, and that was the birth of some of the modern ideas. In Islam, I think what Muslims just became too self-absorbed by their greatness, and they didn't think that they needed anything more. I think they lost intellectual curiosity in their earlier centuries. However, in the 19th century, Muslims started to realize that something went wrong and they need to catch up. That's why in the 19th century, we saw an intellectual trend that is called in the Muslim world Islamic liberalism. I discussed that in my book, why examples of that, why as a Muslim I defend liberty. And some examples of that are discussed by the great late Arab, American or Arab British, I think, scholar Albert Hourani in his book Arabic Thought in the Liberal Age. That is the 19th century and early 20th century, basically. So as he shows that most of the thinkers in the Arab world at the time were more liberal leaning. They were liberal in the sense that they admired a lot of the things they saw in Europe, and they wanted to reconcile them with the Islamic tradition. They were not anti-Islam. They were not secularists in a staunch way. But they were Muslims who admired things and wanted to change things. This had a political impact in the Ottoman Empire. It led to Ottoman constitutionalism. And in 1876, the Ottoman group called the New Ottomans, they were known as the first political liberals in the Muslim world. They should not be confused with the Young Turks, which was a later and worse generation, I should say. They were more militaristic, nationalistic, secularist, and oppressive. But the Young Ottomans were cosmopolitan Ottomans that wanted to bring a British-style constitutionalism. And they led to the Constitution of 1876, the first major constitution in the Islamic world, which abolished the dhimmi system, which gave equal rights to Jews and Christians, limited the Sultan's power to some extent, brought the idea of inalienable rights, to political language, created some sort of separation of powers. Here's a poster at the time celebrating the Ottoman Constitution, which was celebrated as Hurriyet, which means liberty. This was made by a Greek artist from the Ottoman Empire. This is my favorite poster of liberalism in Islam. Here you see in the middle a lady that represents the Ottoman homeland. She was in chains before, but her chains are being broken now by the Young Ottomans. And behind there, you see people happy with the new constitution, and you see a flag with a cross that represents the Christians of the empire, including especially Greeks you see from dress. And there's a lady flying in the air over the mosques, and it writes in Arabic, Hurriyet Musawat Ukhuwat, which means liberty, fraternity, and equality. So this was a constitution that happened under the Caliphate, the Sunni Caliphate, Ottoman seat of the Caliphate. So there was this very interesting late 19th century Islamic liberalism trend. Now, much of the Muslim world is not in that spirit. what happened is in the 20th century, we've rather seen the decline of this early Islamic liberalism, and we instead saw illiberal ideologies dominating much of the Muslim world. Xenophobic nationalism. Socialism became a big deal in the Arab world. All Arab republics, they were socialist Arab republics. And ultimately, the ideological force that we call Islamism and its violent offshoot jihadism is a latter-day force that came on top of that. Now, why is that? Why there was actually a liberal promise which actually receded and then more illiberal forces and came and dominated the scene? Some people say, oh, because Islam's nature is like that. I mean, it can never tolerate liberalism and so on and so forth. But some historians, including myself, have a different answer. Liberalism is not just a Western ideology. I don't equate it with the West, especially because the West is not always that liberal. We all know that. It's just one of the competing ideas in Western history. Second, I think values of roots of liberalism are global, universal. We can find it in different religious traditions. But still, in the past 2 years, liberalism is associated with the West. So in 19th century, Ottoman liberals were looking into Europe and admiring a lot of things. But in 1930, some Muslims who look into Europe saw something else. They saw something not to admire. They saw colonialism. They saw French coming and colonizing Algeria. So Europe now became the enemy. And how do you fight the enemy? By anti-Western ideologies. Soviet Union was there, to offer some ideas. So more collectivist ideas came into the scene. What I'm trying to say is that political context matters. Muslims have been feeling insecure throughout the 20th century because of colonialism, because of endless wars, because of Soviet or Russian encroachments as well, because of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And when this happens, people become more defensive, reactionary. They become less interested in liberal ideas. All across the world, when people feel insecure, they don't feel interested in tolerance and openness, and they are interested in collectivism, a strong army, a fighting spirit, and so on and so forth. That's why I believe if we want to see liberalism go forward in the Muslim world, which is possible, the arguments are out there, the ideas are out there, we also need a better context. And that better context is a context of peace rather than war. It's a context of not confrontation between the West and Islam, but peaceful interactions between the West and Islam. Peaceful interactions like cultural exchanges, peaceful interactions like trades, like commerce, like investment. That is always a safer bet than, wars and conflicts and bombs and drones and all kinds of stuff. So therefore, sometimes people ask me, how can we help, liberalism in the Muslim world? I can say, you can help or unhelp. So you would be unhelping if we have this clash of civilizations concept. But you can help by peaceful interactions rather than violent ones. So I made a slogan. Are you familiar with the term "make love, not war"? That people use this. Well, that's a bit too romantic, but I have a different version of it. Make capitalism, not war. That is a safer bet, between Muslims and the West. And we can all agree on the greatness of Ibn Khaldun on that, and, on the fact that Prophet Muhammad was a merchant, and, many other things that can combine our societies and civilizations and religions. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Okay. We'll have a 15, 20-minute question and answer period. So if you have a question, just raise your hand. Mr. Akyol, call on you.
There's a question right there.
Come to the microphone. Come to the microphone.
Yeah, so in considering our current circumstances in the geopolitical landscape, how ought we, it seems given, Sharia and the more oppressive situation that much of the Muslim world is under, there's not really a conception of liberty right now. So how ought we first implant a conception of liberty such that capitalism could flourish, given the last couple centuries?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the question. I would not say much of the Muslim world is under the control of Sharia. A few words about the Sharia. What is the Sharia? I'll have a very simple answer. It is the Islamic version of the halakha. That's the Jewish legal tradition. Like the halakha, the Sharia controls and has commandments in every aspect of life, from dietary laws. So a Sharia-abiding Muslim would not eat pork. I do that much. Just like a halakha observant Jew, or fast in certain a month, and that's, or have some dress codes and so on and so forth. And some are more orthodox about it, some are less. The controversial part in the modern era is, well, halakha has not had a halakhic state for 2,000 years. So a lot of the corporal punishments that are in the Bible have become obsolete in the Jewish community and the Christian context. But in Islam, because of the unbroken connection between the Sharia and the state, it has lived on. So there are people who believe that the penal code of the Sharia, which is a small part of it, but very controversial one, obviously, has to be implemented. It should be the law of the land. Now, is this the whole Muslim world? Not. I mean, there are Muslim countries that really have Sharia's penal code as the law of the land. About a dozen. I mean, there are like more than 50 Muslim majority states. So obviously the examples are Iran, Saudi Arabia, Mauritania, Yemen. Pakistan has a big chunk of it. And there are parts like in Indonesia, not Indonesia, but a small place called Aceh. In Malaysia, yes, but even some are milder, some are harsher. So that is a major problem. But most of the Muslim world isn't living under the Sharia. I mean, in most of the Arab world, it's just in the family law, not in the penal code. In many parts of the Muslim world, it's not in the law at all. I mean, from Central Asia, Turkey, from my country. And so therefore, it is a problem. It's not the only problem. The other problem in the Muslim world, which is not connected to the Sharia, sometimes it can be justified through Sharia, but it's just political authoritarianism. And there are dictators in in places like Tajikistan, or Azerbaijan, most of the Central Asiatic republics. Well, they're not Sharia-minded, they're Soviet-minded. This is a whole tradition there. Or there are violent tribes fighting each other, or juntas. Not every problem in Latin America was because of Catholicism or connected to that, right? So there are political problems like that. And also there are Muslim majority countries that are quite free. Actually, I published a report with the Cato Institute in 2020, I think, Freedom in the Muslim World. I show that some Muslim majority countries are very free, actually. Some are Iran and Saudi Arabia and Syria at the bottom, very unfree. For example, can you guess which Muslim countries were the freest? Not quite. They're not too bad, but not Indonesia. Any other guess? Lebanon was not too bad again, but it's disintegrating for political reasons, a lot of other problems, but not Lebanon. Good guess. It's Albania and Bosnia-Herzegovina. But people don't even think of them most of the time as Muslim majority countries. Well, they're Muslim majority. They're in Central, like Eastern Europe, and they don't have Islamic constitutions. They have more secular laws, but there are some pious Muslims there, and those Muslims there are fine with that. They're not trying to Islamize the state. So therefore, now it is a problem that if people believe religious law, the Sharia, and what he understands from the Sharia should be the law of the land. That's what obviously Taliban did, right? So there are people who believe in this. They're not implementing it everywhere. There are people who would do it more if they can. And we call them typically at least the hardline Islamists, right? They want to come and impose the Sharia. So that is a problem. Now, the argument against them that first of all, when you're doing that, you're not imposing God's law, you're imposing what you understand as God's law. So you're actually creating your own sectarian tyranny. That's a problem. Second, you're not actually making people more religious. You're actually sometimes pushing people away from the religion. That's something we see in Iran very clearly. In Iran, the Islamic Republic didn't make the society more Islamic. It made the society more anti-Islamic. Iran is the number one country that produces apostates from Islam. number one country that produces desertions to Christianity or atheism. Because if you oppress people in the name of Islam, guess what? They don't like oppression and they started not liking Islam as well. So Muslim world is going through these experiments. Christianity went through its experiments too for a very long time. Bad experiments. So I think some people learn through experiments. Sometimes we make the arguments and ideas. I'm on the ideas front. But so therefore, your question is very true, but the idea of freedom is not unknown. It's just everybody wants it for themselves. The question is, do you also want it for the other guy too? Do you want it for the people you see as heretics too? Do you want it for the people you think as infidels or as religious reactionaries? Let me just add one more that. The lack of freedom problem in the Muslim world is also coming from the secularists. Because we never had Jeffersonian secularism. We never had Mark Tully, unfortunately, teaching us about religious freedom in the. We had always these French-style crazy secularists, even worse than French, wants to ban headscarf. Like in Turkey, I fought those. Not physically, but intellectually for decades. I said, this is not freedom. You are just imposing. You're just a mirror image of Iran. Iran wants to put women in a headscarf, and you want to put women outside a headscarf. So that is also a problem. And I think with all these experiments, Muslims are growingly actually seeing the need for freedom and appreciation. It's just also having the right channels to be able to express that. And with the world of internet, free expression, a lot of things can change rapidly. And I see that. For good or bad ways, but I hope for the good ways. Thank you.
Hi, I'm William Roberts. I work here at the IRD, and thank you so much for giving your talk. I wanted to follow up on your commentary on Sharia. I don't have a very specific question, but I was hoping you could talk more about kind of this distinction between what you called as, the penal code of it, specifically its application or introduction, rather, into non-Islamic countries. You look at Britain as one example, but you can also, although it's half Islamic, Nigeria, where you've seen it introduced initially to regulate things like family law and divorce, but in the case in Nigeria, it was adopted as a penal code as well. Could you comment on how the non-penal code of Sharia, just simply family law, how that interacts or engages with liberalism? I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts.
Thank you very much. Maybe we can speak of different aspects of the Sharia. One is personal observance, and that should not be a concern for anybody, right? A woman decides to cover her head, even her face. To me, if you ask me, that's unnecessary, but if they believe in, they can do it. I'm not going to call the government to go after her as they do in Europe, in some places. Or just 5-day prayers and things like that. But the Muslim daily observance, right? That should not be, that's religious freedom. The other aspect of Sharia is like financial issues, economic. Like, can you use interest banking, or do you need, Islamic banking? That is, again, if you are not forcing it on anybody, people can make those choices. Some Muslims are uncomfortable with conventional banks. They go for Islamic banks. They actually do the same thing just by using different techniques. But if they are more comfortable with that, that's fine. Muslims have endless questions about things like, is Bitcoin halal or haram? Like, that's, some people say yes, some people don't know. I don't understand still how Bitcoin works, so I'm old school. I don't know. People can't go. There's a whole way of practicing the Sharia without coercion, right? As a community, you ask your imam, just like you ask your rabbi, what is religiously permissible or not? Can I drink this? Can I eat that? People do this in any free society. If they do it in England, it's fine. If they do it in Turkey, it's fine. So there's no problem with that. There's family law, the next level. There things get a bit complicated because there are family laws which says, a man has more rights to divorce the wife than woman, right? In medieval times, actually, Islam was sometimes even more advanced than what was the global norm, but things changed a lot. So these things are very archaic. Now, if you ask me, if people voluntarily follow these things as a community, I have respect for that too. But they shouldn't try to make it the law of the land for everybody which is the demand by most Islamists, especially in the Arab world. So the question is, you should allow people to abide by the Sharia and live by it as long as they don't violate the rights of other people and they do it as a voluntary community doing its things. Now, are there examples of this in the West? Yes. In the UK, there are Sharia courts. When people hear this, people say, oh my God, they should be stoning people in the middle of London. No, what happens is this. They're very conservative Muslims in the UK. So a husband and woman, they are divorcing and they want to make it kosher. I mean, halal, like in the right way. So they go to an imam, they ask what to do. Imam writes them a paper, talks to them, get their views. Sometimes they help in domestic violence and things like that. And that is an arbitration court recognized by the British law, which doesn't violate the British law. Now, I have no problem with that as long as they say, oh yeah, let's stone you for adultery or something like that. I mean, if they give a verdict, but they don't do that. They just in this divorce marriage inherit. Now, who already has been doing this and Muslims got an idea from? Orthodox Jews. They have this system called Bet Din. They've been doing this for, decades. And Muslim says, let's follow the example. On many issues, actually, our Muslims are following the Jewish example on dietary laws, kosher, and that's fine. That's religious freedom. That doesn't mean those people will bring Sharia next day to UK or to Kansas, or Oklahoma or something like that. Which doesn't mean there are some crazies out there who would like to have a Sharia state and so on and so forth. But before the UK, they should bring into Turkey first, or even Egypt, right? Their Sharia is not even there in most of the Muslim world. So I would be cautious against people who want to see Sharia as the law of the land. But then this doesn't mean that everybody who says, I want to live by the Sharia is violating or threatening other people's rights. My motto is that we should understand Sharia as something not to be enforced, but something to be practiced. If you're practicing it as a voluntary community, let alone an individual, that's not a problem, and people should accept that and respect that. And I can't see anyone who wants to, for example, bring Sharia as the law of the land in Oklahoma or Texas. I know because people try to ban Sharia there, but who's wanting that in the first place? Muslims in the West overwhelmingly accept the principle, the law of the land is the law. Like if you're in this country, we're accepting its laws. Ideally, they might want to maybe live in a more liberal Islamic country, but they're living here and they say, we made a contractual agreement with the state, so we accept American laws or European laws. But they might have a very conservative life, and I think that's a good model that's developing, which should not be demonized, but quite the contrary, accepted. Yeah. You're welcome, sir.
I was going to say this real quick. We have time for one more question.
I'm Andrew Fink. I wandered in from the street.
You're from, sorry?
No, I said I'm just a civilian. I'm a
Me too, yeah,
contractor.
great.
Yeah. One of the standard sort of lines that I hear when people talk about the difference between European Christian civilization and Islamic civilization is the idea that, Islam had a unified empire doing offensive, conquering warfare pretty fast. And how would you respond to that and respond to, let's say, a conservative Sunni Muslim who says, hey, I like capitalism, I even like religious pluralism, but we need to reestablish the caliphate?
Yeah, there are guys like that. I debate with them all the time, right? Like, should there be a caliphate? Do we need something like that? There are groups that really think that it is such a crucial Islamic duty to reestablish the caliphate, right? They're not the majority. Even most conservatives that I would not agree with on some of these freedom issues, they would tell you that, yeah, caliphate is an ideal, a kind of utopian thing. It would be maybe good one day, but we're living in this country right now. That's our reality. We have to put food on the table, and we have to first teach people how to pray. Who comes to, the caliphate, that's the kind of standard, actually, conservative view. The passion for the caliphate often comes when Muslims feel Muslims are being killed somewhere, right? We need a caliphate to protect us, right? Muslims are being slaughtered, oppressed. Oh my God, a caliphate will protect us. I think that's also a utopian thing. What you need is a wiser diplomacy and stronger states and a better understanding of the world scene and more feasible goals rather than utopian ones. Now, I debated a guy, Abdullah Andalusi, in London 10 years ago. I mean, it was about Islam and liberalism. And he defends a caliphate. He thinks Muslims should have a caliphate. And the answer to that is, I mean, was it you were asking? Like the sort of...
Well, both for how you respond to a Muslim like that.
I mean, what is the caliphate? The caliphate is Prophet Muhammad passed away, and Muslims didn't know what to do now, right? They already had a state-like polity, an army, and what to do with it. They chose one of his successors as his successor, like his companions as his successor, which became the caliph. Caliph means a successor. He's not a prophet anymore, but he's the head of the community, head of the Muslim state. And then it just went on and on and on. Now, my view about this is that this was not a Quranic commandment. The Quran doesn't say when Prophet Muhammad dies, one of you will be a caliph after him and everybody should follow him. The Quran doesn't define what after. The Quran is not interested in what happens after Prophet Muhammad. The Quran is speaking to him, to his issues. Prophet Muhammad doesn't even have a clear commandment about who's going to replace him. Well, the Shiites differ on that, but at least let's say the Sunnis. But that distinction also shows that things were not that clear. In my view, the caliphate is the historical experience of Muslims. Right? He passed away. They lived in an environment that everybody had a state. Otherwise, you would be killed and perished. So it was a thing of the times. Some caliphs were good and nice. Some caliphs were tyrants. There's nothing sacred about it. And what Muslims need are just states in which they can live and thrive as Muslims. There could be a caliphate that you as a Muslim would run away to a Christian kingdom or even an atheist one if that's a more just place that gives you more justice and security. So the eternal principles of Islam are not caliphate or sultanate, but it's justice, rule of law, security. There are 5 intentions of the Sharia, as the classical scholar says: the protection of religion, life, property, lineage, and the intellect. They extracted from, like, why God bans wine? Oh, because that messes up with the intellect, so God wants to protect the intellect, right? With that reasoning, maybe you should also ban, I don't know, censorship or dictatorship too. That messes up with it. But, they didn't go that far. But or why God bans, why adultery is punished, right? So that's it. They realize that adultery is punished because, I'm not saying adultery should be a crime in America or somewhere else, but they thought that if you don't have that, you don't know whose child is who. So the lineage, the family collapses, right? So the goal is protecting the family, protecting lineage or family. There are 2 terms there. So I would say there's a tradition that studies the intentions of Islamic law, in the political law, and they can be served in any state. They could be served in Sweden better than some supposed Islamic state you may have. So that's the more liberal or democratic argument. But other guys will say, Imam Mawardi wrote that caliphate is a must for Muslims. And I'll tell them, well, you know what? If I lived at the time of Imam Mawardi, I would say that. But now I see liberal democracy doesn't work bad. I mean, come to America, it's okay. But you didn't have that option at the time. So it's also being able to distinguish the religious tradition and the unchangeable core of religion. Now, on one issue, Muslims have already figured this out. I think that's the issue of slavery. Slavery was a part of Islamic law until the modern era. And now overwhelmingly Muslims would tell you, well, it was not Islam's intention. Islam just found it in a historical context. It mitigated it, made it milder to getting rid of it was the right thing to do. So I think if we make that interpretation there, we can make that interpretation on other issues, on women's rights or these coercive measures of blasphemy, apostasy, and similar measures, and religious policing. That's also a big part of it. So can you make a society by banning sin? Can you make a society more moral by that? Or do you actually lead to hypocrisy and immorality? That's also something I discuss a lot with Muslims who believe in that.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.